Okay, so today we're going to continue our discussion of panics, and it's really interesting. So far, we've been talking about the Panic at the Who concert, which happened in the 70s. You're going to be studying the War of the Worlds disaster, but we also want to look at more in-depth information about how panics form and what causes them to persist and ways to perhaps keep panicked behavior from occurring. So let's first look at how panics originate. And it's important to understand that they originate often from a generalized hysterical belief. Now remember, a generalized belief gives focus to anxiety or discontent and is instrumental in fostering consensus amongst crowd participants. So if as a collective the crowd is anxious, there are factors that are strengthening that anxiety, then they're more likely to panic. Now here's a quote from a supplemental text that I use, and it says, "Panics are based on generalized hysterical beliefs that transform an ambiguous and sometimes harmless situation into a definite and potent threat." So what can cause a panic? Sometimes we have rumors of impending disaster, descriptions of crimes, stories of monsters, stories of UFOs. All of these and more provide the basis for generalized beliefs. People then reach a consensus that they must escape this impending disaster, and a panic occurs. There's a great example of this when we look at the War of the Worlds broadcast. The stock market crash of 1929 was a financial panic where the generalized belief was one of hysteria, and people felt that in order to save what they had to sell, and the stock market crashed as a result. When we look at theoretical perspectives, contagion theory and value-added theory both view panic as a necessary ingredient. So especially with the value-added theory and the 5 determinants, we look at how the generalized belief and panic are interrelated. But the panic leads to a sense of confusion and personal helplessness, especially in times of disaster. So we're going to focus for the next few minutes on specifically disaster. Unfortunately, multiple disasters have occurred in the U.S. And worldwide. We're going to be looking at the Hillsborough Stadium disaster as well. But these disasters also provide a very interesting analysis of how people respond in a disaster. Emergent Norm perspective takes a little bit different approach, though, and acknowledges that yes, panic can be present, but its role is minimized. So what we mean by that is Emergent Norm perspective looks at how people interpret and adapt to the situation and how they change their norms throughout the scenario unfolding. So in some panics, people aren't being irrational like contagion theory would say. Instead, they're adapting to the situation and redefining their norms as to what's appropriate. So while rushing to an exit might be called a stampede, in reality, it's adapting to the situation. So here's another quote from the Miller text. "The likelihood and extent of flight are increased if people have experienced anxiety or other kinds of emotional strain prior to the disaster." And this makes a lot of sense. If authority figures have been stressing the rising levels of a river, forecasting flooding, and then also discussing the increased likelihood of a levee failing, these threats can lead to more anxiety and a perception of terror and the need to flee. So what we're going to look at next is how the media has and continues to impact our perceptions of disasters and panics. In disaster reporting, media consistently uses the words panic and stampede. They often cite trampling as the official cause of deaths and injuries. Media also heavily exaggerate the amount of looting that occurs. Official documents show that looting at disaster sites is very low, especially compared to civil disorders such as riots. Media outlets consistently report disasters from the standpoint of a community breakdown model. This means that deviance increases, selfish behavior is prevalent, price gouging increases, and that social order is diminished. But is this really accurate? No, it's not. Disaster studies document people's high level of concern for and generosity towards disaster victims. Now you have a supplemental reading that I've posted on D2L, and this looks at some smaller scale disasters as well as some large scale disasters, which includes club fires and airplane crashes. And throughout those readings, which I really encourage you to look at, it's important to note the selfless behavior of flight attendants, concert goers, people like that, as they really strive to help each other survive the incident rather than every man or woman for himself or herself. So let's look at two of these specific examples. The first is the E2 nightclub in Chicago, where 21 people died from being crushed on a narrow stairwell. And this occurred in 2003. Here's a title from one video, Raw Video, Scene of 2003 E2 Nightclub Stampede. When I first saw this title, I prepared myself to see something horrific, primarily because of the words raw and stampede. The video, a little over 1 minute in length, shows rescue personnel treating victims and also shows many people stuck in the exit. But that's it. But the media title led me to believe that this was going to be a little gruesome. An article was published in the New York Times later that day after the disaster, and this article was titled 21 Die in Stampede of 1,500 at Chicago Nightclub. Here's some of the wording used. 21 people were killed and 50 more injured early this morning in a terrifying stampede that officials and witnesses said erupted at a nightclub after security guards used mace and pepper spray to halt a fistfight between two women. A city lawyer said the second-story club was open in violation of a court order, a contention the club's lawyer disputed. The club, known for raucous dance parties, had been ordered shut in July because of 11 violations of fire and building codes. James T. Joyce, commissioner of the Chicago Fire Department, said that several of the building's doors were locked or blocked during this morning's melee, and that most of the victims died when they were crushed by some 1,500 people, perhaps twice the permitted occupancy, pouring down a single narrow staircase. Witnesses described a horrific stampede as people fell on the stairwell and piled on top of each other. The melee was made worse because the glass front doors were shut by the crush of bodies. Now, those are 3 paragraphs from the New York Times article. And again, this was reported in the hours following the disaster, so the same day reporting. But what's interesting is the wording that the reporter chose to use. A terrifying stampede, erupted at a nightclub, raucous dance parties. Some other ones, the melee. Most of the victims died when they were crushed by some 1,500 people, which really brings up an image of people just pouring on top of each other. And so this creates a very specific image in the minds of readers. And the question here is this image correct? Well, let's look at some further news footage and reporting to see if, in fact, this was an accurate report. Okay, so after the initial report by the New York Times, of course, many media outlets carried additional reporting. This is a report from CNN 1 week later. Here's a couple of excerpts from their article. This was a popular club, and it seems that everyone has said that the use of mace or pepper spray by security guards was the event that set this all off. So again, if you remember the earlier article from the New York Times, they were saying, hey, that guards used mace to break up a fist fight, and people then panicked. Not really the case, not what happened. But we were told by people who go to clubs frequently that it is not tremendously uncommon for pepper spray to be used inside of a club. It's not unheard of, and it has not led to this sort of a mass tragedy. Some people who didn't see that incident, however, apparently thought there was some sort of terrorist attack. Some of them shouted poison gas, we are told. Someone made the reference, quote, "I'll bet it's bin Laden," end quote. This may have made the panic worse. Okay, so we're seeing 2 news stories 1 week apart that are very different in their scope. The first one is more intent on describing the incident and uses some really inflammatory language. Also, that article, in essence, is placing blame on the club itself. The CNN article, which came a week later, gives us a little bit more light. It says, hey, it's not uncommon for mace to be used in clubs, and someone misinterpreted what they were smelling or seeing, and had a different interpretation of that as a terrorist attack, which then started people to leave the nightclub and crowd the stairwell. So let's talk about this a little bit from the theoretical standpoints. We're not going to cover all of the elements of all the perspectives, but we're going to hit some of the highlights. So we see several aspects of collective behavior present in this incident. There are several factors of structural conduciveness. First of all, overcrowding. If you allow 1,000 to 1,500 people into an area designed for 400 people and add a narrow stairway and doorway, yeah, there's going to be some issues. That narrow stairwell acted as a funnel, and the funnel got clogged. Too many people were trying to exit the building all at the same time, and they got stuck in the stairwell. An additional factor is the Department of Homeland Security's decision to raise its national threat assessment terrorist alert from yellow, which is elevated, to orange, which is high. This was less than 2 years after 9/11. It's understandable that people at that time would be very aware of potential threats. So those are two factors of structural conduciveness. Let's shift over to the emergent norm perspective and also look at uncertainty. We see this element present in a variety of areas with multiple participants. Club patrons weren't sure what was going on. Those who had not seen the fight broken up with pepper spray smelled the fumes, and one shouted that a terrorist attack had occurred. Police experienced uncertainty. They were initially called to respond to an asthma attack. When they responded, they had no idea that a crush had occurred, and it took time to recognize that problem and then call for reinforcements. Official reports show that paramedics who were responding were not informed about why they were responding, which created additional confusion. So uncertainty was occurring in a lot of groups with this incident. So if we just stick with the initial reports of the E2 nightclub disaster, we would have an idea that this was a very irrational event. Despite multiple studies indicating that the idea of a terror response, which really implies irrationality and selfish behavior, is prevalent, often this is the response reported by the media when a disaster occurs. Hopefully, however, you're learning not to believe everything you see or read and to look further at factors that both lead to or hinder a panic occurring. In addition, many researchers are looking for better ways to prevent panics and crushes occurring. For example, you can check out this link to look at some crowd panic research that's being conducted. It's also helpful to be educated about and aware of factors that can increase the likelihood of a crush or stampede. The first is overcrowding. If a venue allows participants to enter beyond an established capacity, the chance of a disaster occurring increases tremendously. Seems common sense, right? But a lot of our disasters that have occurred over the last 100 years have been the direct result of overcrowding. What happens when an area is overcrowded? Why is it such a big deal? Well, first, communication is hindered. Those in the back of the line or crammed into a small space with little room to move, they can't see much around them, nor can they communicate with those in the front of the line or across the room. Their line of sight is also hindered. So it's difficult to see additional exits. You really have more of a tunnel vision where you're focused just on what's immediately around you. So because the ability to see exits is reduced, that's one reason that people tend to use the same entrances and exits. It's familiarity. So this is an adaptive response. The line of sight is restricted, so people adapt by trying to use the entrance or exit that they had previously used. It's not irrationality, it's an adaptive response. Another impact of overcrowding is an increased time to getting out of the building. Makes sense. More people equals longer time to get out. Think about how quickly fires can spread and how quickly people can be overcome by fumes or smoke. So this actually ties in with the second reason or the second factor that it can increase the likelihood of a crush or a stampede. And this is inadequate instructions for dispersal. So think about it. In some places, there's a lot of signage. You can clearly see where exits are located. You can see where restrooms are located. It's easy to identify the different parameters of the building. So when you're in a crowd or in a threatening situation, if someone gives instructions that can identify the threat, specify immediate movement, identify exits, and direct portions of the crowd towards separate exits, when these occur, they're least likely to result in a panic or a crush or a stampede. So think if someone is up on stage and says, okay, folks, we have reports of a fire. Let's be calm. Remember, you have the exits behind you, but you can also exit through the kitchen. So those closest to the stage, please come around the left side of the stage and you'll find the kitchen behind us, and that has exits outside. So if you're directing people towards different exits, you're minimizing that disorientation that can occur, and you're giving them a viable way to escape the building without panicking, without crushing, without stampeding. But not always is there someone like this available. So what can you do? Well, one thing is take a few minutes to familiarize yourself with additional entrances and exits, including those behind a stage area or through the kitchen. And this ties into the third factor, is inefficient use of exits. Sometimes exits are barred or locked, and that was one of the initial reports of the E2 nightclub disaster, was that the doors were locked. But video footage from the club itself shows that the doors were wide open. Nothing was barred, nothing was locked. But what we see is when we do have disasters, in most cases, some exits aren't used. And this comes again from that lack of familiarity. In restaurants, think about the last couple times you ate out. You enter and leave through the same exit. And rarely, if ever, do you access the kitchen. Nor do we pay much attention to the presence or absence of additional exits by the restrooms. It's just not in our common consciousness. We're used to entering and exiting in the same way. And so we don't think, hey, where else can I go? Here's a quote from the Miller text from 2014. Quote, occupants' limited knowledge of available exits and entrances that can be reached only by negotiating long hallways, stairs, and other obstacles are common circumstances. So Miller is saying, hey, not only do we have to familiarize ourselves with them, but if we're having to go down long hallways or go up and down stairs or meander through some other rooms to get out, that's going to increase the likelihood of a disaster occurring because it's not a straightforward entrance or exit. So all three of these, overcrowding, inadequate instructions for dispersal, and inefficient use of exits, are factors that can increase the likelihood of a crowd disaster occurring. So last but not least, there's a link here called How Crowds Can Kill You. I know, kind of puts you on edge there a little bit, but it's a really informative link and gives you some information about the nature of crowds.